Okay. So yeah, hello everybody. As Gipe said, Mairead O'Connor is my name, and I am the trainer with the wheel. And we are, as Gipe already introduced us, we're the largest association of civil society organisations in Ireland. So we spend a lot of our time, and myself in my role as the training and advice coordinator, I spend a lot of time talking about governance with organisations. It's probably the biggest question that we get from organisations at the moment. It's the topic that's people think is most important in the current climate here in Ireland. We have a charities regulator in Ireland, and they, I suppose, really focus people on their governance practice. The charities regulator talks to the board, the people who are the volunteers who govern the organisation. That's who they're interested in. And I presume it's very similar in other jurisdictions around Europe. I know, for example, in the UK, it's a very similar relationship. The people on the board, in the positions like Caddy is in ADEPT, are the people that have the ultimate responsibility. So very important that you get this bit right. So the presentation today is going to be about good governance. So how do you do it in a way that is good for the organisation, is good for the people on the board, and helps you to fulfil your mission. That's really the ultimate aim, is that through good governance, you can really make sure that your organisation achieves what it's setting out to achieve. That's the ultimate goal. But what is it that we talk about when we talk about governance? What does the word governance mean? And that's one of the first challenges with it, because the word itself, it's one word, but it actually includes an awful lot of different aspects of the running of the organisation. And it's a complicated, complex thing, governance. One thing that the wheel have done is to summarise what good governance would mean or would look like for the community and voluntary or civil society sector. And that's what's on my next slide. So what does good governance mean for the community and voluntary sector? The first line, what's appearing on your screen there now, the trustees, the governors, the directors, the board. What that, I suppose, tells us is that we tend to use a lot of different words and vocabulary to describe the people who do governance in our organisations. We've lots of different words. Here in Ireland even, just amongst the organisations in Ireland, there's lots of different language used around this. And I'm sure when you talk about across Europe, we've got huge variety in the way that we refer to the people who do governance. And that's, I suppose, one thing that we have to get clear on first is, who are they? What do we call them in our organisation? Is everybody in our organisation clear on who that group of people is to start with? Then once we're clear on that, once we're clear on the people who it is that are responsible for governance, we then have to figure out, well, what is it their job is in the organisation? What's their role? And the first piece of the puzzle is that they are there to provide leadership. So that's in the first step, that's what they are there to do, is to provide leadership. Now that can mean lots of different things to lots of different people. And I suppose one way to think about it in an organisation that's part of civil society, in a voluntary organisation, is that think about how your organisation got started in the first place. Think about the story of how your organisation got together in the first place. And if you think about it, that story is a story of leadership. It's a group of people. In your example, it's probably a group of people from a particular country coming together, and they're diaspora, they're living in a new situation, They're getting to grips with a new culture, and they came together in order to help each other and help other members of the diaspora. And what they did was they came together on a voluntary basis, and they stepped up to the plate, as we say in English. They took on that challenge together, and they wanted to create change in their communities, or they wanted to help other people in their community. And that's a story of leadership. So the very basis, the very starting point of your organization is a story of leadership. And I suppose that's the role of the board or those who govern, is to keep that alive, to hold on to that story of leadership and make sure that somebody else, you know, that's handed down generation to generation in the organization. But of course, you have to think about, well, what's practical? What can you actually do to provide leadership on a day-to-day basis? What does it look like or feel like in the organization? And one of the very practical ways that you can provide leadership is to develop a strategy or a plan for what the organization is going to do over the next period of time. So what is it that our goals are? What is our objective over the next year or 2 years or 3 years? What are our what's our mission? What ultimately is our vision? What do we want to bring about in the world? So being very clear about what it is we're trying to achieve and putting a plan in place, putting a plan on paper to actually get us to that vision. That's the responsibility of the governing body. Other people in the organization will help with this. You'll be talking to staff, you'll be talking to volunteers, you'll be talking to stakeholders and funders. But the board, the people who govern, they are responsible to make sure that it actually happens, that there's some plan in place, written down on paper to say what is it we're going to do over the next period of time and how are we going to do it. The other part of that, the other side of that, is that the board are also responsible for providing the resources. And I'm actually going to just reveal the whole slide because I realize the French translation hasn't appeared yet. So I'm just going to pop that up there for the French speakers on the webinar. So if you just look there, we're talking about ensuring the resources are provided. So you have to put a plan in place, but you're also responsible for making sure that there's enough money, enough staff or other kind of human resources, the correct buildings, whatever it is that's needed to bring the plan to reality, to make the plan a reality. That's important as well. So you have to put the plan in place, and you have to also provide whatever resources are needed to make it a reality. The next piece then is putting policies, providing policies to govern operational activity. So policies, we're very used to thinking and talking about those in our organizations. And they're all about how we do the work that we do. And it's very important that the governing body take responsibility for having policies in place. Because those who govern, the volunteers on the board, while they mightn't be there day to day to oversee the operation, to oversee the activities on the ground, they're always responsible at all times. And so it's really important that there are clear policies on paper that staff and volunteers can refer to ensure that everybody is consistent in the work that they do, that everybody is safe in the work that they do, that the organization is really clear on its legal obligations and meeting those through its policies. So it's really important that they're in place as well. The next point is delegate delivery of strategy to the CEO and hold the CEO or the manager to account in relation to the delivery of the strategy. The board relationship with the staff of the organization is really key. And the staff are there to serve the board. The staff work for the board, and they are there in order to actually make the plan a reality on the ground. But then they have to report back to the board against that plan. So how is the plan working on the ground day to day? That information has to get back up to the board and to the governors, to the people involved in governance. And they do that through a reporting framework that the board sets for the CEO. The next piece, again, I'm sure it's as relevant in your country as it is in Ireland, ensure compliance with legal obligations. And organisations are finding, in Ireland anyway, that there are more and more legal obligations on them, that it's more complex. Every year there are more regulations that have to be followed. And it's the job of the board to ensure that all of those obligations are being met. Again, staff and volunteers will work with the board to make sure that at the end of the day they identify what legal obligations are out there, what changes and regulations are out there. But it's the responsibility of the board to make sure that at all times the organisation is complying with those obligations. The second last point is assess risk and ensure that it is managed. Risk management is a huge piece of work for all organisations. It's got to be something that you approach in a planned way, that you put a system in place in order to manage risk. And again, it's related back to that first piece about leadership and about having a plan set out on paper. Managing risk is part of actually making that plan a reality. Unless we look out for and identify the risks that might prevent us from reaching our goals, then we leave the organisation vulnerable. And it can be small risks or very large risks that could completely wipe the organisation out. But we have to be aware of them and manage them in a way that's planned, and that's important. And the final piece then is be seen to be accountable to stakeholders. And this is really key for civil society organisations in particular. We have to be seen to be accountable to all of the people and the organisations that could have a stake in our organisation. So if you think about your stakeholders, just take a moment, think about all the various people and organizations and groups that you could consider to be your stakeholders. Maybe just take a moment and maybe write down who you can think of as your stakeholders. Make a short list. Hopefully you'll see quite a number of stakeholders on that list. It will be staff, it will be the community that you serve, the people in that diaspora community that you work with. It could be volunteers, it could be your funder, it could be a regulator, it could be partner organisations that you work with across Europe, it could be someone like ADEPT that works as a network body, it could be your regulators, the organizations that you are responsible to in your country. It could be stakeholders that are members of the community or the government in the country of your origin. So you'll have a very wide and varied group of stakeholders, and you have to be accountable to them. So you have to be able to answer questions that they have about your organization, and that could be anything from what your organization does on a day-to-day basis, what your plan is for the next 3 years, how you spend the money that you are given, what impact you're having on the ground for the communities that you serve. Those are the kinds of questions that you'll be asked, and you'll be expected to answer them. And I suppose the extra bit that makes it more complicated for organizations like ourselves in the civil society space is that we have to be seen to be accountable as well. We can't hide our work from others or from stakeholders. We can't hide our finances. We have to have it all out. Transparency is the word used often in this context. We have to be transparent. We have to do everything as if we were doing it in public. And that's part of our responsibility as civil society organizations. So I suppose that's a summary of the role of governance in our organizations. At this point, are there any questions that people have, or is it fairly clear, all of those elements, or does anyone have any specific questions at this point? I'm happy to take them. Jipe, I don't know if you can see the text box. I can't on my screen at the moment, but
yeah, I'm trying to follow up. I think no questions at the moment. No question. Maybe I just kicked about ruling. You made mention of a key component of good governance as risk management. Can you please give some examples of the kind of risk that might, appear in a civil society organization?
yes,
Maybe
I can.
just about a few examples of kind of risks that are prevalent, and how you can actually manage them, please.
Yeah. I suppose the best way to think about risk is to start off again with that high level vision. What is it we want to achieve in our organization? So if it's to provide support to a particular community, if it's a particular diaspora community, that might be our mission, that we want to support them to have good lives in the country in which they live. Then a risk would be something that would get in the way of us doing that. What would be an obstacle to that? And that could be anything from, I'm just trying to think of clear examples that would be out there. It could be that one risk could be that we run out of funding, that our funder no longer supports us. Or our funder pulls their funding from the organization. So that's obviously a big and obvious risk, and it would be one that would have a very negative impact on the organization. It could, in fact, mean the end of the organization if we don't have a plan in place in order to manage that risk. So in many cases, organizations, if they think, many organizations in the civil society space rely on one or maybe two funders, that they have a very narrow funding base. They rely on one or two funders for all of their fundraising. And if that's the case, then you are vulnerable to the one or other of those funders no longer supplying that funding to you. So one way to manage that risk is to diversify your income. So to find other ways of getting income into the organization, so that you're spreading out the risk. So if you have more funders, then you are, you're not as vulnerable if one of them decides to no longer support your organization. Well, at least, it's not leaving such a big hole in your finances. So that's, I suppose, one very big obvious one that most organizations will have to deal with. Other risks could be around health and safety. If you have staff working for your organization, then you have a big responsibility in order to provide them with a safe working environment. And if you have people visiting your offices, for example, so those are some of the clear risks, I suppose, for organizations. You have to provide a safe working environment, or if you have public coming to visit you in your offices, that it's safe for them to be there. So that's one of the clear ones. You should do a health and safety audit. You should have health and safety statement, and somebody responsible in the organization for ensuring people's health and safety. And I suppose another risk that often organizations might put on events, where they invite their public or the members of their community along to those events. And, often organizations will do a risk process before the event to identify any risks, whether it's kind of physically, where people are coming to an event, that there might be physical risks, or it might be that you don't sell enough tickets or whatever. So in that scenario, one of the ways you can manage it is by getting insurance. That's one of the risk management options, is to buy insurance to transfer the risk from your organization to the insurer. So that's another one. I won't have time to go through too much more about it, but we could share. We have risk management tool that's freely available on our website, and it might be useful as a resource. So Gipe, I'll email you on the link to that after this webinar, and if you want to share it with the members of the network, we'd be very happy for you to do so.
That's very cool, thanks.
Okay, so
je voulais juste poser une question avant de quitter ce slide. Sur le titre, c'est sur la gouvernance. Il y a les administrateurs, mais il y a la direction exécutive qui est employée. Donc, quand on parle de risque, qui est le premier responsable? Bon, on sait que le premier responsable d'une organisation, c'est son board. Mais sur l'exécutif, c'est-à-dire les opérations au quotidien, est-ce que les risques peuvent être partagés, soit comme une direction comme ADEPT où on a le board avec un président, mais on a un directeur exécutif, on a un directeur financier, on a un directeur des opérations et d'autres managers. Dans ce cadre, où se situent les degrés de responsabilité par rapport aux actions, notamment financières? Voilà, c'est en question. Est-ce que Nelly ou JP, vous pouvez traduire à Mairead pour une réponse?
Oui, oui. Oui, merci. Je vais traduire ça. Mais Mairead, what the Kadi is saying is that in an organization like ours, yeah, I think my colleague Nelly is actually typing it in English.
Yeah,
can you see it on the typing box?
I'm just going to open it up now and see.
Yeah, but I can still say it. What she is saying is that in an organization that has a governance structure, you know, with different sections, like you have the board of directors, you have the management team led by the executive director, and within the executive director, you have like the finance manager, you have staff of different portfolios. And she's saying that who is actually responsible, who bears the gross responsibility if maybe a kind of risk is not well managed, for example, in the finance sector? Will it be, yes?
Yeah, so yeah, I think I understand the question. So it's who's ultimately responsible? Is it the executive, the staff, or the board who are the ultimately responsible?
Yeah.
So I suppose one thing I'd have to say on this is that you would need to check this with your local laws. So it will probably vary from country to country across the EU on this. I know in Ireland, ultimately the responsibility is on the volunteer board members. The staff have a responsibility to the organisation, but the board have the ultimate responsibility under Irish law for risk management, for example.
Yeah. I think it's the same in Brussels.
Yeah. And can a staff, for example, who mismanages, can the staff face litigation? Or maybe the responsibility will be shifted to the board?
Again, it probably depends, I would think, depending on the jurisdiction in which you're operating. In Ireland, it's very clear that the ultimate responsibility is always with the volunteer board members. Now, staff can be held, you know, if somebody is deliberately fraudulent, for example, then they're breaking the law. You know, they're breaking certain, there could be criminal proceedings brought against them. But the board of the organisation would also have to prove that they have put in place good structures and procedures to protect the organisation from fraud. They'd have to prove that they've done that, if you know what I mean. And that would be one of the risks, you know, fraud would be one of the risks in terms of finance. So there are shared responsibilities and duties that the executive and the board have, but it's worth checking in your local law in the country in which you're operating who has the ultimate legal responsibility. In some countries, the executive might have more legal responsibilities, but for example, in Ireland, it's the volunteer board members who are ultimately the ones who are responsible for the organisation. So definitely a question. It's a good question for the board to ask itself and maybe to ask its legal advisors. It's, you know, if you have somebody who you can ask about these things, it's definitely a conversation worth having at board level.
Okay.
Is that okay?
Thank you.
Great. So I'm going to go back to the presentation. Hopefully you can all still see my screen. So another useful way of thinking about governance is the governance code, which is what I'm going to talk to you about now. Gipe mentioned it earlier. So in Ireland, the civil society came together in 2012. You can see there on the slide, and they launched this voluntary code of good governance, and it's a framework that you can use to think about the governance practice in your own organization, to look at it and to measure it against best practice. It's been quite successful. A lot of organizations have found it very useful. There's been very good feedback on it. So I'm going to give you kind of an introduction and an overview of it. And if you're interested in finding out more about it, you can go to governancecode.ie. You'll see the website address there at the bottom of the slide. And you'll be able to, after the webinar, you can go there and download all of the information about it for free. It's all freely available online. It's very much an open resource for any organization that wants to use it. So how does it work? What does it look like in practice? It's the first thing to say about the code is that it's proportionate. Okay, so depending on the size of your organization, it gives you a different set of guidelines to follow. So that's useful because one of the things about the civil society is that it's so varied. There's organizations that are very large and very well resourced, and likewise there are organizations that are very small and might be completely dependent on volunteers. They might have no staff at all. So the code recognizes that difference between organizations, and it's broken into three types: the type A, the type B, and the type C. The type A is the purely voluntary small organization with no staff, where the board would have kind of they would have to take on an executive role as well as their governance role. The type B then has a voluntary board, but it's supported by one or two staff. So the board have some support from staff and therefore can take on a bit more of the governance responsibility. They have more room and time for it. In the type C then, that would be the largest organizations, and they would have enough staff and professionals involved that the board can actually focus entirely on the governance role. They're not involved in the day-to-day operational work on the ground. The board are fully focused on the governance role. So those are the three types of organization that the code addresses. And the code is very useful in that it summarizes good governance into 5 principles. And it says the governance in the civil society is all about, number 1, leading; number 2, exercising control; number 3, being transparent and accountable; number 4, working effectively; and number 5, behaving with integrity. So that's the main element of the code, is that it summarizes good governance into 5 principles. And these, no matter whether you're working in Ireland or France or Germany or Malta, these 5 principles, you can use these to think about your governance. They kind of go beyond the legal requirements, and they really set out what good governance best practice is all about, no matter what context you're working in. And that's what I suppose makes them so useful, is that they're so universally true. The code then takes you down to the next level of detail, and under each of these 5 principles, it draws you a picture of what that would look like in reality in the organization. So it becomes more practical. So for the first principle, leadership, the code says that the best boards provide leadership by agreeing our purpose, vision and values, and ensuring that they remain relevant and valid. By developing, resourcing, monitoring and evaluating a plan to make sure that our organization achieves its stated purpose, and by managing, supporting and holding to account staff, volunteers and all who act on behalf of the organization. So that's what the code says about leadership and what it would look like in an organization. Agreeing our purpose, vision and values. So that idea of having the plan in place, knowing what the organization is trying to do, putting it down on paper and making sure that you have the resources to bring it to reality, and then holding to account anybody, whether they're staff or volunteers, who are actually doing the work on behalf of the organization. Is that clear to everybody? Does anyone have any questions at this point on the governance code or this particular principle?
I think it's very clear. Maybe you should continue then, maybe after the presentation, if people have questions.
Great, we'll take them at the end.
Yeah.
Okay, so principle 2 then is about control. And sometimes people are uncomfortable with that word, control. I suppose it's useful to think about it as appropriate controls. So what controls do we need to have in place in order to make the organization effective? And the code says the best boards exercise control by identifying and complying with all relevant legal and regulatory requirements, by making sure that there are appropriate internal financial and management controls, and identifying major risks for our organization and deciding ways of managing the risk. So again, I suppose it comes back to that sense of understanding what are our legal obligations, what do we have to do in order to stay within the law. We have to put controls in place so that the finances of the organization are managed correctly, and we don't waste money, or we don't leave ourselves vulnerable to fraud. And we have to identify risks, think about them in advance, and put in place ways of managing them. We can't, if something goes wrong, it's not good enough to say, oh, well, how could we have known? We have to have spent time thinking and looking ahead to identify what, the risks that we can. Obviously, things will go wrong. You can't always, you can't manage every risk. Things will go wrong. But as long as you can show that you took care and time over your risk management, then you're in a better position to respond. So that's principle 2. Principle 3 then comes back to what we were talking about earlier, accountability and transparency. And remember, I asked you to put a list together of your stakeholders. That's very relevant here. The code says the best boards are transparent and accountable by identifying those who have a legitimate interest in the work of our organization, i.e. our stakeholders, making sure there's regular and effective communication with them about our organization, by responding to queries or views of stakeholders about the work of the organization and its governance, and by encouraging and enabling the engagement of those who benefit from our organization in the planning and decision making. Now, this is, I suppose, a very specific principle that civil society organizations have. Organizations that are for profit or corporations don't have the same requirement to be transparent, open, and accountable. Because we in the civil society serve the public, and because we're mainly in receipt of public funds from tax or from fundraising from the public, we have a greater expectation of openness, transparency, and accountability. And this principle of the governance code recognizes that. So we have to be open to communicating with all stakeholders, including the public, the general public. We have to be ready to answer questions. But more than that, this principle of the code gives us a challenge. It says we have to be proactive about our communication. We can't just wait for the question to be asked. We have to go out there and put our information out into the public. We have to, for example, the Wheel would always say that organizations in civil society should publish their finances on their website. You should publish your financial accounts on your website. Now, maybe they're in your own country, you might already be obliged to do this, or that information might be publicly available through regulators' databases. But we would always say that you should also have it on your own website, and it should be easily accessible to the public. Because remember, if somebody has a question about you, that's probably where they'll go first. They'll go to your website and they'll try to find that information. And if a member of the public or a member of your community that you serve goes looking for that information and they don't find it, what will they think? Immediately, they'll think you're hiding something. And you can't be seen to be hiding any information. You have to be open and transparent with it. So Principle 4 then is very much about the board itself, the group of people who are on your board. And it says that the best boards work effectively by ensuring that our governing body, individual board members, subcommittees, staff, and volunteers understand their role, their legal duties, and their delegated responsibility for decision making. It also says that it needs to make sure that the board, as a board, we exercise our collective responsibility through board meetings that are efficient and effective, and that we have an effective renewal process in place as well. So it's very much, this principle is very much about the board looking after itself. The board has to make sure that everybody on the board understands their role, has a sense of what their legal duties are, and that over time that board members get the training they need, and that you're also planning for the renewal of the board. How are you going to get, when the people who are on your board at the moment are finished and they're ready to retire from the board, are you ready to bring new people on? And that's, I know it's a challenge here in Ireland. I don't know what the situation is like in your own context, but it's definitely one of the biggest challenges for organisations here in Ireland, is finding new board members who are willing to take on the role and take it on a voluntary basis. So that's something that organisations have to think about and plan for and come up with imaginative solutions to that. Principle 5 then, integrity. The best boards behave with integrity by adhering to high standards of honesty, fairness and independence, by understanding, declaring and managing conflicts of interest and conflicts of loyalty, and by safeguarding and promoting the organisation's reputation. This is again all about the board itself and the members of the board. And I suppose as members of civil society, we set ourselves very high standards. We make claims about the work that we do that set us apart from the for-profit world, the corporate world. And we say that we are values-driven. And because we make those claims about ourselves, we have to make sure that we adhere to those high standards, that we work that we are honest, that we are fair, and that we are independent. And one of the ways we have to do that is to manage any conflicts of interest. This is where somebody on the board may have an interest in a decision that's being made through their own maybe work or their connection with another group or another person. And at all times, you have to manage those in a transparent way. You have to have some way of dealing with a conflict of interest scenario. And that's the code in summary. It's, as I say, it's based on the 5 principles. If anyone has any specific questions about it, I'm very happy to answer any of those. And I'll take you through the kind of logistics of actually working through the code in a moment. But just, I'll take a pause there, Gipe, if there are any questions about the principles or any of the material we've just looked at.
Yeah, I'm scrolling down. I can't find questions. Does anyone have questions? Please, if you have questions, you can type them in this box so that we can read out the question. So I can't find anyone with a question.
Okay. I'll keep going. So, and if I'll come back to them then as we go through, but I'll keep going for the moment then, Gipe.
Yes, that's okay, yeah.
So, the code takes you, it gets very practical. We've looked at it so far. It gives you 5 principles that are the principles of good governance in community and volunteer civil society organizations. It also then shows you what they would look like in organizations. It gives you, as we've looked at here, the picture of what the best boards would do, okay? And then it takes you down to another level of detail in what are called the checklists. And in each of the checklists, you'll see that it deals with a principle. So in this the checklist that you see on the screen now, it says Principle 1, leading our organization, and the sub-principle are agreeing our vision, purpose, mission, values, objectives. And then under that, it tells you the kind of evidence that you might find in your organization if you were adhering to that principle. So if you were living that principle in the organization, you would have an agreed constitution. You would have certain policies in place. And it asks you to look at each of these in detail and then think about whether you are complying with that element of the code. You can use the checklist for your type of organization. So, you know, if you're a large organization or a small organization, it will give you specific examples of what you might need, okay? And what I suppose we would say is that if you're going to use the code as a way of thinking about governance in your organization, then you need to put a strategy in place, okay? So how are you going to work on it? You know, it's going to take quite a bit of time and effort to go through all of your governance practice and look at the code. So you need to set aside some time and think about how you're going to tackle it. If you note up the top of the checklist, it gives you a list of boxes that you can tick. So the first box beside the piece of evidence there, 1.1a, agree the purpose and objectives of your group, you can say whether you comply or whether you don't comply but intend to bring yourself to compliance. So if you comply, if you have it already in place, you tick the first box. If you don't have it in place but you are looking to put it in place, then you tick that second box, don't comply. You outline what action you're going to take to achieve compliance, you put a date in place, and you identify the person who's responsible. Over on the far right, it says don't comply, an explanation for not complying. And that's a key element of the governance code. So if the piece of evidence doesn't apply to your organization, if there's no reason for you to have that particular policy or procedure or way of working in place, then you can say we don't comply and here's why. It's not relevant to us. So that's one of the elements that makes the code flexible as well. So it can work for lots of different types of organizations, working in lots of different contexts. As you move through the checklists for each of the principles, these are some of the questions that you need to ask of yourself and your organization. So under Principle 1, the code asks, do you have a mission statement? So do you have a statement that sets out what it is, the kind of work that you want to do? Do you have a written plan? Do you have something on paper that sets out what you're going to do over the next period of time? And who does the work and who are they accountable to? So if you're going to do the work in the plan, who's actually going to carry it out and how are they held to account within the organization? Under Principle 2, Control, the code asks you, have you identified what your legal obligations are? Do you have appropriate financial management? Do you have a policy in place to manage your finances? And what are the risks to your organization and how do you manage them? It asks you to have these set out in detail in your organization. The checklist for Principle 3, Transparency and Accountability, asks you things like, who do you need to communicate with and how do you do it? How do you listen to people's views about the work of the organization? And how do you seek feedback from the people who benefit from your group? It's all about communication, Principle 3. Principle 4, Effectiveness, asks, do board members understand their roles and responsibilities? Are board meetings efficient and effective? And is there suitable board development, recruitment and retirement in place? Again, all focused on the board itself. Do the people who are on the board understand their role? Is the work of the board effective? And is there a plan in place to get new people onto the board? Principle 5 then is all about integrity, as we looked at earlier. One of the practical ways you can ensure that you work with integrity is having a code of conduct in place for board members. Do you have a policy that allows you to deal with conflicts of interest or conflicts of loyalty? And how do you safeguard the organization's reputation in practice? What do you do in order to make sure that you cover that element of your responsibility? So those are some of the actions that the code asks you to consider in your organization. Have you got those pieces in place? And for many organizations, you will already be doing some of it. You'll be able to answer yes to quite a number of the actions. But for every organization, there will be areas where you need to improve. And that's the point of the code, is that it shows you what you're doing well, and it also shows you where you need to improve, what new things you need to start doing, or areas where you need to tighten up on how you're doing it. And that's really the whole purpose of it. It is a tool. It's very much all about self-regulation. Okay, it's up to the organization themselves to do the work and to identify where work needs to be done. So that is the governance code for civil society organisations. As I say, developed in Ireland for Irish organisations, but the principles, the 5 principles, leadership, control, transparency and accountability, board effectiveness and working with integrity, they could work for any organisation in any context, in any country. So I think there's a lot in it that you could use in your own context, wherever you are across Europe, or even in America, as I know there was somebody on the webinar over in the States. So you can use those principles to look at how governance works in your organisation, no matter what kind of jurisdiction you're working in. I think that's the beauty. There's those universal principles that underpin good governance no matter where you are. So I suppose it's back over to you. Are there any questions that anyone has? I'll open up the webinar again.
Yeah, Mairead, I think that was a very, very comprehensive presentation, and it went detailed as much as possible. And actually, as you said, it provides us a clear picture on what is expected, from organizations in terms of stakeholders, what stakeholders expect from them, what the community expects from them, what funders, expect from organizations, what partners expect from organizations, and all boils down to good governance, and effective stewardship of resources. So I don't know if anyone has questions for Mairead. Please, this is the time to ask your questions now. We anticipated this webinar to be interactive as much as possible, so please feel free to ask your questions. Any questions? Yeah.
Hello, Ray. I don't have a question actually, but I hope you don't mind giving me a repetition. I missed principle number 4, especially this, when I ran to the toilet because I didn't want to disturb people. I wish you could go back a little bit and give 30 seconds of principle number 4, please.
I can, no problem at all, Shay. I think that's who's talking, isn't it? Yeah, so principle 4 is all about the board and the way it works itself.
Yeah.
It's about effectiveness. So it says that the best boards work effectively by ensuring that the governing body and the board members, anyone involved in subcommittees or staff or volunteers, that everybody understands their role within the organization and also understands their legal duties and any responsibilities that have been delegated to them. So everybody needs to be really clear on their role in the organization and any legal duties that they have. Also, it's the responsibility of the board to work together so that they have collective responsibility and that their meetings work well, that the meetings are effective, and also that there is a board renewal process in place. So not only does the board have responsibility for itself now, but the board also has to look to the future and figure out how are we going to get new people involved. When we're ready to retire, who's going to be coming onto the board, and how are we going to make sure that we have the right people ready to step up and join the board when we're finished. So it's about the board kind of self-regulating, looking at itself and thinking about how are we operating now, are we doing so effectively, and how are we going to make sure that in the future the same applies, that we have an effective board over time. Does that answer your question, Shay?
Of course, and that gives that tops up with the checklist of this good communication will work effectively in this principle. I'm very grateful for that summary. Thank you so much.
Yeah. Communication, I think, across all of the principles is really important. Exactly. So that the organization, everyone is very clear. Clarity is one of the, when we talk about good governance, when I talk to groups about it, a lot comes back to that idea of clarity, about knowing who's responsible and what they're responsible for. And there can be lots of problems in organizations where there's a lack of clarity about who is responsible and what their role is in the organization. If people have different ideas of what their role is or what other people's roles are than the reality, then you can have conflict, you can have a lack of direction, you can get involved in risky activities. So it's really important, I think, that clarity and having things written down on paper is really important in that. So, yeah.
Last question.
Je peux poser une question?
Yeah, just last question, please.
So, if you're asking question, please, can you maybe tell the audience, like your organization, just some few seconds, then it gives you opportunity to also, talk about your organization, just a few seconds,
Thank you, Jipe. Just last question before Kadi comes in. I'm sorry to interrupt her. When she talked about that was risk management and so on, or consequences or whatever, that led me to the kind of organization which I have and the rejoiner that GP is coming on. We have a cultural and development organization where our main focus is to see how we can eradicate poverty back home in Africa, precisely in Cameroon, the country where I come from. And one of the risk factors now that we have, which GP was asking on examples of such, will be a war situation or a political crisis situation that we have, that everything seems to stand at the halt, where we cannot even send assistance home because we don't even have the people available. On such situation, how do you expect, or how can you think about the survival of our organization in this case, where our main focus of implementation is grounded?
Yeah, I suppose that's a big one, Shay, and obviously a very serious risk that you're dealing with. You know, there'll be lots of organizations who wouldn't have to face as serious a risk as that. Do you actually send people on the ground, or are you sending funds to organizations that are in Cameroon? You know,
both. We send people, we send funds, and we also send equipment. We send material stuff like school equipment, hospital materials as well.
Okay, so I would say from a board's point of view in that situation, with dealing with such serious risks, I would say that you probably need even professional, making sure that you've got some professional expertise looking at your risk profile. So it wouldn't be a case that I would say that myself as a volunteer would join the board and you'd kind of work on them together. You know, in certain organizations that's appropriate, where, you know, the group of volunteers get together and think about the risks. Where the risks are so serious as you've outlined, that's where the board would need to think about employing or whether it's expertise on staff or contractors to have a look at your risk management profile, and think about how you're going to manage those very serious risks. So I wouldn't be able to give you, I'm afraid, examples of how you might manage them, but what I would say is it's something that you need to think about very seriously, plan for. And I think also, and we see that a lot here, is that organizations can work together. Similar types of organizations will be able to share a lot of expertise on this. So there are lots of organizations like yourselves that work in difficult you know, areas where there might be conflict or where there might be particular safety risks for their staff, and they will have, you know, there will be best practice already in place around how you know, make sure that the people, that the equipment, that the finances are kept safe. So it's kind of working with other organizations, finding out what they do, asking them for their policies and their best practice and working with them. So I'm not sure if that's the answer you were looking for, Shay, but
of course I listen to the advice, of course.
Yeah, but it's definitely one that the board would need to be very aware of, is when you're dealing with very serious risks like that. And I suppose sorry.
Go on.
One thing I was just going to say about risk management is that it changes over time. So risk can't be something that you just deal with once a year or once every couple of years. Risk, you might do one, you know, you might do a very in-depth risk analysis once a year, but you also need to be monitoring it over the course of the 12 months. So, and that can involve staff and also the board. And you want to have some kind of system where the board can get updates on where risks are and where a risk might be developing and getting more, you know, some risks are less likely to happen, but you know, over time they might become more likely, and the board has to have some way of seeing that. You know, oh look, you know, 12 months ago that risk was very low, but now look, it's actually growing, you know, in likelihood. And the board have to have systems in place, and again it comes back to communication, where that information comes back to the board so they can see over time where risks are moving, whether they're getting less or more likely or more serious or less serious.
That's right.
I think Kathy has a question. Maybe Kathy, are you still there? Yeah.
Hello.
Hello.
Yes. Hello. Do you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Coffee.
Hello.
Yeah, Kofi, how are you? Can you go on and ask your question?
Okay. So thank you for the presentation. Can this code, civil society code, also be taken as a code for good practices? Does it represent the same thing?
Yes. Kofi, it does. I mean, it's what we would say is that the code, it demonstrates best practice in governance. It gives you a roadmap, if you like, to best practice in governance. So depending on the country in which you're operating, you will have certain legal obligations, minimum standards that you have to meet in your governance. But it's likely that the governance code gives you another layer of kind of beyond that, if you like. So it's something that you can aim for. And as I outlined in the presentation, within the code, there are these checklists that give you in a lot of detail the kind of actions you can take in order to improve your governance practice. So tell you the kind of policies you need to put in place, the kind of activities you need to be doing on a regular basis, the kind of roles that you need to have in your organization in order to make your governance more effective.
And you said these things are this information is they are all downloadable on your website, you said.
They are. So if you go to www.governancecode.ie, and I'll share that link with Gipe so he can email it out to you after. But yeah, it's all on governancecode.ie.
Okay, thank you very much.
You're welcome.
Kadi, are you still there?
Yeah, I'm here.
Okay.
Je voulais juste poser deux questions. La première, c'est sur le principe 4. C'était voilà, la responsabilité collective des membres du conseil d'administration. Est-ce que c'est la responsabilité collective veut dire que tous les membres du conseil d'administration sont juridiquement responsables devant la justice s'il y a un problème, ou collectivement responsables par rapport à la prise de décision? Ça, on le sait, le conseil d'administration souvent dirige l'organisation, même si c'est une personne élue qui emporte le mandat. Ça, c'est surtout la responsabilité juridique par rapport à l'organisation. Est-ce que c'est collectivement que les responsables, que tout le board est responsable? Et l'autre question, c'est par rapport au principe, ne quittez pas, c'est le dernier, le principe d'éthique et de, comment vous l'appelez encore? Sur le principe 5.
The fifth principle, I think what is the fifth principle again, Mairead?
Yeah, the fifth principle, Kadi, is to work with integrity. So it's about
integrity,
integrity, yeah. And I suppose
voilà,
integrity, yeah, that's the...
Voilà, integrity. Integrity, quand on parle de conflit d'intérêts, on le situe parce que nous, on est une organisation qui travaillons avec nos membres qui sont des organisations. Et ces organisations souvent contractent avec l'organisation mère pour effectuer des services. Les services que ADEPT peut solliciter à travers des pools d'experts, des pools de consultants, mais aussi des experts qui peuvent être recrutés dans son propre réseau. Donc, où commence le conflit d'intérêts? Je ne parle pas de membres du board, mais de membres du réseau. Et quelles sont les limites aussi de contracter avec directement les membres du board sur des expertises que portent ces membres du board? Voilà. J'espère que c'est clair pour la traduction.
That's right. I'm going to translate. I think I start with the last one, which Kadi is asking about the conflict of interest. And if you can see, Nelly is also typing on the typing box, so you can see the translation there as well. So she is asking about the conflict of interest of probably board members, as well as the organizations that are associated with an organization like ours, because our members are African diaspora development organizations, and we also have a network which also include, a pool of African diasporans and consultants within our network. And some of these African diaspora experts are also maybe board members within their respective organizations. In terms of maybe contracting with them, will there be any kind of conflict of interest? On how can we avoid that kind of conflict of interest? That's what.
Okay. So the first. Oh, sorry. Yeah. Will I answer this question first, and then
yes,
we can?
Sure.
Yeah. Yeah. So I suppose the first thing to think about is that conflicts of interest will arise. There isn't a problem with them happening. It's how you manage them that's important. So conflicts of interest will arise, but how do you manage them? That's the important thing. So you gave me an example there, and I think it's a good example of where there's a possible conflict of interest. So your board is subcontracting to people involved in your member organizations. So you've got the ADEPT network, and you've got, for example, ADEPT have a piece of work that they want to do around governance, and Mairead O'Connor, who's involved in the Irish diaspora group in Ireland, could do that piece of work. There's, I sit on the board of ADEPT, or somebody in my organization sits on the board of ADEPT. There's a conflict of interest for that person, okay? Because if you think about it from an outsider's perspective, if you think about it from the best way to think about conflict of interest is to think about someone outside of the organization looking at the situation. Could they think that I got the job of work because my colleague sits on your board, or because I maybe sit on your board? And if there's a chance that they could think that, then you've got a possible conflict of interest here, okay? And if there's any way that I can make money from the decision, and I'm involved in the decision making at the board, or if my organization could make money and I'm sitting on the board, then you have a definite conflict of interest. And what you have to do in that situation to manage it is to have a system in place, something written down and policy in advance. And that would usually require that if a decision comes to the board that could involve a financial gain, for example, for me or for someone connected to me, then I have to step away from the decision making, the discussion and the decision making on that issue. And it should be recorded at the board. It should be in the minutes of the board meeting that I went out of the room for the duration of that discussion and the decision.
Okay.
Now, usually there will be regulations on these things at a legal level in your own country, and I know in Ireland, in the law that governs charities, there are, it sets out some guidelines on this. So it's worth, again, checking what the legal situation is, because it might be very specific and it might give you good guidelines on how you are supposed to manage conflicts of interest. But as a baseline, think about how somebody outside the organization would look at that situation. Would they have suspicions, if you like? That's one good way of a test. Yeah.
Yeah, I think that's a very good answer. Yeah, Mairead. The second question is, she was asking if an organization faces litigation, because the board has the sole responsibility to ensure that the organization is run well. And in case an organization faces litigation, is it all the board members that will appear in the court, for example, or maybe specific members of the board that will be sued?
I suppose it depends. And again, it depends on the law in your own country. But speaking about my knowledge in Ireland, for example, each individual board member has legal duties, but then also collectively they have those duties as well. So where, for example, if a board member is not at a meeting and a decision is made, that board member is still responsible for the decision, even if they were absent from the meeting, for example, in Ireland. So that collective responsibility is there at all times. Now, if a board member went off and defrauded the organization, if there was a fraud carried out by an individual board member, obviously that's a very serious thing, and they individually would be held accountable for that in the law. But equally, the board as a collective are responsible in that situation for making sure that there were good controls in place, that they did everything they could possibly have been expected to do to try and prevent that fraud, or when they found out about it, that they did the right thing and carried out the appropriate controls. So I guess there's both. There's both an individual responsibility on board members and also that collective responsibility. And that's something you need to check with your individual law in your own country that you're operating in. Definitely, again, it's worth having that conversation with the board, and if you require it, bring in your legal advisor, bring in your lawyer to talk to you about it if you have concerns or questions about it.
Great.
Okay, merci.
And any other questions? Oh, Mairead?
Can I come in there?
Oh yeah, Joseph, you can, yeah.
Thanks, Mairead. I came late there. I didn't catch the most of the conversation, but I got an idea actually from the discussions here and your last slides there. I really appreciate a nice, really thorough presentation. But what I just want to cross-check there with you, what is the status of the board? Let's say, for example, there is an issue of longevity, in terms of serving on the board itself. Does it mean that there should be laws that have to be enforced for someone to live as stipulated in the Constitution, or what's the procedure? And if the rules have been broken, for example, and even maybe the chairperson or any other office holder is being elected on that position for almost continuously, what are the repercussions of that to any organization?
Oh, okay, Joseph, just so I understand your question, I'll repeat it back just because there was a bit of the sound was a little bit unclear, but just I think you're asking, are there rules around how long people can stay on the board? And for example, you gave the example of a chairperson who is continually in that position over a long period of time. Are there any rules or regulations around that? Is that what you're kind of asking about?
Yes, and how can that be enforced really as collectively, like, in the board itself?
Okay, again, I suppose I'm going to need you to go off after this and check up in your own jurisdiction in the country in which you operate. Are there laws around this or regulations? I can give you the example in Ireland. The most important document when you're thinking about an issue like this is the constitution of the organization. So the governing document that you have, whatever that rule book is for the organization. And a good constitution will set out how long board members should stay on the board, and when, what kind of retirement process there is for board members leaving and new board members coming on. So a good constitution should have rules around this. You could also have policies and procedures in the organization that give you detail on that. Beyond that, then, within the organization itself, there may be regulations from a regulator, like you might have a charity regulator or other kinds of state regulators that set out the length of time that board members can sit on the board. And I suppose that's an easier one to enforce, if you like, because that's an outside regulation that you can point to and say, look, you know, we actually are obliged under the law to only you know, have board members that, you know, that only sit for a period of time, 5, 6, 7, 8, 10 years, whatever that figure is under the law. If your constitution is good, it will also allow you to enforce it, because you'll be able to, at the next annual general meeting of the organization, or whatever your member meeting is on an annual basis, you'll be able to point to the fact that, okay, you know, there are a certain number of people who are coming to the end of their term now and they have to step down from the board. There can be issues where organizations don't have a good, strong constitution or don't have a policy in place. And if that's the case, then it becomes more difficult to enforce, because it becomes personal then. It becomes you saying to that board member, look, you're in this position too long, you need to step down. And that board member can say, well, you know, where does it say that? So what I would say is, in order to avoid any conflict or issues around this, you should research the regulation in your country. Are there laws that govern, that say how long somebody should sit on the board? And if there aren't, then have a look at your constitution and your board policies and procedures and put in place some rules around this. You know, how long should people stay on the board? You know, when should they come off? How is that process handled? So if you don't have rules in place, I would, you know, look to get them in place, because that way it becomes depersonalized. It isn't about the person, it's about the policy. Does that help?
Yeah, thank you very much. That answers my question. Yeah, thanks, Mairead.
Great. Any other question for Mairead? Mairead, maybe I just jump in here. I think one important point that you made is how it can be very difficult to renew the board, maybe like bringing in new members, new energy into the board. And that is a kind of a challenge that civil society organizations are facing today. I know you are in a position that you are working with so many civil society organizations in Ireland. I don't know if you can give us maybe an idea, any organization that you've come across that have maybe developed procedures to encourage people to join. Like ADEPT as an organization is a membership-based organization. Members' participation on the governance of ADEPT is a key element, you know, of the organization. Maybe if you have any kind of examples, ideas that you can share with us on how to actually enhance this.
Yeah, I think there are a few things. I think it is always a challenge, but there are things that I've seen that have worked very well in organizations, and member organizations in particular, I think are at an advantage in a way, because you have people, members who are interested in your organization going forward. They want it to succeed. So I suppose one very good practical way is to use your subgroups or of the board. So if you don't already have subgroups or subcommittees of the board, I'd encourage you to look at setting up subgroups. And these are committees that work alongside the board, and they might have a particular focus. You might have, for example, a finance committee, or you might have a risk management subcommittee, or a communications subcommittee, for example. And on the subcommittee, you might have 1 or 2 board members, but also you can have experts, other people outside the organization, and maybe members might join the subcommittee and help with running the organization, and get a feel for the governance, get to know how governance works, and maybe build up their confidence so that after a time, they might be interested in joining the board itself. So it's a way to, first of all, to get work done in an effective way. It's a very efficient way of helping to run the organization, but it also introduces new people to your board, to the governance structure in the organization and might encourage them eventually then to join the board. I think board training is really important, and supporting board members, because a lot of us are, you know, we don't want just professionals on our board. So, you know, you can invite accountants and you can invite lawyers onto your board to join your board, and they're bringing specific skills, and that's great. But also you want representatives from your communities on your boards. So encouraging people, inviting people to join the board, and providing the training and the supports they need in order to become good board members is important. Because for a lot of people, they don't have the experience, or they might not feel that they have the experience to join the board. But what you can do is work to support them and make sure that you have a really good, strong board development process in place, so that when people show an interest, you can say, you know, we'll provide you with the training. If you're enthusiastic, we'll provide the training. A lot of boards as well will do, they'll advertise the roles, you know, in a way that reaches out maybe to communities that they're not already engaged with. So maybe through professional networks, or through local media, or through social media. They'll advertise that there's a role that they want to fill on the board. They might have particular skills that they're looking for, or they might just be looking for, you know, anyone who shows an interest. And then they have a process through which they screen the people who apply. So you need to have some kind of a screening process if you're going to do that kind of open advertisement. But it can work very well. I've seen it work well for organizations where they kind of advertise very widely, and then they meet with the candidates who apply and, you know, find out who the best fit might be for the role. Is that useful?
Yes, very useful. Thanks very much for that insight here. Any other question? Maybe we have about a few minutes to go. If any person has maybe one last question for Mairead. Okay.
I'm okay,
Yep.
I'm okay. Thanks.
All right. Yeah. Anyway, on behalf of in the absence of questions, on behalf of the participants, I would like to thank you, Mairead, you know, for that very brilliant and insightful presentation. And as you clearly said, I will email the presentation to people. And in case people want to follow up with Mairead for any training, they can contact her directly. And the other thing that we are trying to make sure that our webinars are useful to people and that they can address the emerging needs of African Diaspora Development Organization. So we will be doing a survey of our webinars, and we will be sending you a link of the survey maybe in the near future. So, and also in the survey, we would like people to suggest the topic that they would like us to cover in our future webinars. So we don't want to inundate people with so many emails, but please, if you see an email or if you receive an email from us about webinars, then it is an email that will give you the opportunity to contribute to where you want us to take these webinars to. So thank you very much. I think it is still sunny here today, and maybe people want to go out, and I hope, you know, that people enjoy it. And thank you very much. I'm looking forward to talking to you again. And maybe I just say the last thing. As I said earlier, our next webinars will actually hold at the end of the month. The webinar for this month will be on the 29th of May. I think the topic will be about digital marketing, on how to prepare digital videos and engage audience and stakeholders. But we will be communicating information about this webinar in the nearest future. So thank you very much and enjoy the rest of the day.
Thanks very much, everybody. It's a pleasure. Bye now. Bye.
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 Merci, JP.